Now let me take this opportunity to introduce, to give everybody a little bit background information about Europe Asia Economic Forum. It's headquartered in Vancouver, beautiful Vancouver, Canada. EAEF is an emerging think tank platform that specializes in producing research about Canada's public and foreign policies. Founded in 2020 as a grassroots initiative, the EAEF is dedicated to supporting the comprehensive development of multilateral relations among European, Asian, and North American states and markets by conducting independent public and empirical research, as well as promoting free and open dialogues among different groups. So the EAEF's faith is laid in the principles of impartiality, openness, innovation, and excellence. And also, I know some of you probably know Mr. Tom Tao very well. He's the founder and chief executive officer of the Europe-Asia Economic Forum. He's also the founder and the president of Northern Wine, Bowen Wine and Spirits Merchants, and the president of Vancouver Wine School. All right. So, and also tonight we have the honor to invite three distinguished speakers, Mr. Hugh Stevens, Mr. Wei Shao, and Mr. John Guzman. They will explore the astonishing resolutions of the cases of Meng Wanzhou and the release of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the latest Canadian federal election, and the impact on Canada-China relations, with a focus on the medium to long-term prospects of bilateral economic and trade ties. Tonight, we'll also feature your questions to the panel with a designated Q&A session. So my colleague, Mr. Wang, you will see his name tag in the chat room. I believe is under the EAEF. And so he will summarizing and collecting everybody's questions from the audience and pass on to me once our panel finishes speech, and I will direct your questions to the panel at the Q&A session. So now it's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist, Mr. Hugh Stevens. He's a distinguished fellow, Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada, and also he's a executive fellow, School of Public Policy. Sorry, I just had I think I got a signal drop. So Mr. Stevens, can you please go ahead, please?
Thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining this interesting discussion. As Lisa mentioned, this is a significant day, and I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. First, I'd like to thank the organizers, the EAEF, for the invitation to speak on the topic of Canada-China relations, which, as we all know, comes at a very, very apposite time. First, right after the re-election of the Trudeau government, although with less than 1/3 of the popular vote, and of course, after the sudden resolution of the Meng Wanzhou Michael's affair. Now, we could discuss at length whether hostage diplomacy worked and who blinked first, and there will be many different views. But the important thing is the outcome, and that outcome is that a major bilateral irritant has been removed. However, does that mean we will return to what the Chinese initially referred to as a golden age of Canada-China relations when Justin Trudeau was first elected, or even to the situation prior to the arrest of Ms. Meng? I think the answer is clearly no. The well, unfortunately, has been badly poisoned on both sides, and Canadian public opinion will act as a constraint on measures to relax scrutiny of Chinese investment in Canada, as well as remaining wary of actions by China with regard to trade disputes. In Canada, we will shortly be seeing, I expect, an announcement on Huawei and 5G. In effect, that decision has already been taken by the major telcos. But does Huawei still have a place in this country as a supplier of goods and services? Well, we will see. And I think that decision, frankly, will be a bellwether as to the direction in which the Trudeau government is going. Whether there is a very hardline response or whether there is a more nuanced response to the Huawei situation. Of course, it's not just the Meng Wanzhou affair that has influenced Canadian public opinion. Without going into a lot of detail, I just mentioned Xinjiang, Hong Kong, South China Sea. I think those terms speak for themselves. But of course, the Meng Wanzhou Michaels affair is a very important factor. But also the role of the Canadian media in focusing on what some commentators like to refer to as China's quote unquote thuggish behavior does not help the dialogue or in moving forward. All that said, let's look at the broader context. China's important global role and discuss what can be done in terms of Canada-China relations. China has weathered the pandemic to now remarkably well, although some cracks are showing in the Chinese economy, the most recent of which are the rolling power outages we've been hearing about. China was the only major economy to have positive growth in 2020. This continued through the first half of 2021. And I'll note the economy is now starting to slow and some major financial issues have evolved. And I just mentioned the word Evergrande and people will know what I'm talking about. Most analysts still predict a robust 6 to 8% growth of GDP this year. You know, China may have its weaknesses, but I would say don't bet against China. In addition, China plays an outsized role in global supply chains despite the shocks of the pandemic. A recent Government of Canada study estimated that China supplies 1 in 12 goods globally at the HS6 level, the tariff classification under the harmonized system. That same study indicated that almost 50% of Canada's production inputs have some Chinese content. Losing any of those imports could cause significant damage to the Canadian economy and Canadian businesses. Just as one example, 97% of Canadian industries import electrical equipment and components, as well as computers, computer peripherals, and parts from China. Because of COVID, of course, there has been some reshoring and push for diversification of supply. But China is not easily replaced as a cost-effective and reliable supplier. The shipping constraints that face China, and they are serious, are also faced by other producers. It's all too easy for commentators, academics, and officials to preach trade diversification. It's much less easy for businesses to effect it. Now, turning to the political fallout from the Meng Wanzhou Michaels affair, I think we're going to see that the Trudeau government will proceed very cautiously, including with respect to trade discussions and any form of architecture between the two countries, even a sectoral discussions. However, this approach will still be more pragmatic and less ideologically driven than would have occurred under a government led by Erin O'Toole. At the same time, let's not kid ourselves, Canada is going to continue to push for wider acceptance of its initiative to condemn and eradicate the practice of arbitrary detention, and will continue to promote the action plan to advance the declaration on arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. This policy position is not going to make Beijing happy. We have to take account of this reality. Canada will continue to speak out on Hong Kong and on the re-education camps for Uyghurs in Xinjiang. These again are political realities that have to be factored in. But let's not forget that bilateral trade rebounded in 2020 and 2021 despite frigid political relations. So there is a reasonable chance, I think, that trade and investment and political issues can be dealt with on parallel tracks, not separate tracks. There will be crossovers, but nonetheless, the two countries should be able to focus on the bilateral economic interests of each of them while dealing with the other issues where there are more significant differences. One significant development, I think, is China's continued push for liberalized global trade. We can have our reservations about how prepared it actually is to put its principles into practice, but it has certainly been spreading that gospel in many different fora. The most recent example of this, of course, is its application to join the TPP-11, that mouthful, the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Pacific Trans-Pacific Partnership, of which, of course, Canada is one of the founding members. Now, this application by China presents Canada with both a dilemma and an opportunity. Canada will need to determine its position on Beijing's application. It can kick the can down the road for a little while, but it's going to have to make a decision. And this, of course, is not unrelated to Taiwan's almost simultaneous application to join the CPTPP. Canada will also be constrained to some extent by its commitments under the CUSMA, the USMCA, or the new NAFTA, whatever you wish to call it. The article that was inserted at the request of the US, Article 3210. Now, this article requires that any of the three countries, i.e. US, Canada, or Mexico, must notify the others 90 days in advance of any intent to negotiate an FTA with a non-market economy. The only one that meets that definition, although China is not named in the agreement, but the only one that meets that definition is China. And if negotiations begin, they are to share negotiating information and positions. In extremis, the other members can withdraw from the USMCA and substitute it with a bilateral agreement that suspends certain provisions. So in a sense, it could be seen as a sword of Damocles hanging over Canada and indeed Mexico, but at the very least, it's a road bump. So both Canada and Mexico are going to have to deal with this in responding to China's interest. And as many people know, I'm sure, the United Kingdom has applied to join the CPTPP, and an accession party on negotiation has been formed. Now, frankly, to me, it's not clear whether China is really serious in its economic commitment to CPTPP membership, because if it were to meet the so-called dress code or the standards of the agreement, this would require a fairly significant way in which the Chinese domestic economy is managed. I know some have argued that China is actually not that far off the CPTPP standards, and it's also recently, of course, become a member of the RCEP, or is a member of the RCEP, which is going to come into force next year. But I think that still a number of changes will be required, and that may in fact be welcome to some economic reformers in China. On the other hand, it could simply be a political chess move to expose the US, in a sense, non-strategy in Asia Pacific, and also to scramble the cards on Taiwan's application. We'll have to see. And we'll have to see how the US responds. The US, of course, is not a member of the CPTPP, having withdrawn when Donald Trump took office. On the other hand, if China is serious about meeting the agreement standards, this presents a real opportunity for Canada and for others, and it also gives Canada some leverage. So we'll have to see. Now, at the same time, just sort of moving slightly beyond the economic range, the Trudeau government has committed in its platform to launching a new Asia-Pacific strategy to deepen diplomatic, economic, and defense partnerships in the region. That's word for word from the policy platform. But the focus is on building stronger economic linkages. So as Canada develops this Asia-Pacific strategy or Indo-Pacific strategy, China will clearly need to be figured into that, although it will not be the exclusive focus. We also have to take account of the US-China relations and the US-China push. In a couple of areas, the most recent is the Australian nuclear subdeal and greater profile for the Quad, Japan, India, the United States, and Australia. Canada, of course, is not a member, but these groupings will present Canada with some challenges also in developing its position. And the question will inevitably rise, how much room for maneuver will Canada have? Hopefully it will have some. So as I mentioned, China will play an important part in that strategy, although it will not be the exclusive focus. It cannot be ignored. And now that the logjam of the Meng Wanzhou Michaels affairs out of the way, the work to build a more productive relationship, to recalibrate the relationship, although it will be difficult and slow, can finally begin. So I'll close my remarks there, and I look forward to the comments of our other commentators and to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hugh Stevens. So for the audience who just joined us and you probably missed the beginning, let me introduce Mr. Stevens one more time. You just heard a very in-depth speech from Mr. Hugh Stevens. He's a distinguished fellow from Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and executive fellow, School of Public Policy, University of Calgary. And Mr. Stevens, I believe everybody, when you heard his speech, you already know he has more than 40 years of government and business experience in the Asia Pacific region. And his topic has just focused on the diplomacy involving the 3M cases. And I believe he mentioned CPTPP, and the most recent US, UK, Australia, the new security agreement, and also the intention and the for China to apply for the CPTPP. I believe we already have quite a few questions just sent in. So Ms. Stevens, I think I will, at the Q&A session, I'll direct that to you. So next, let me have the honor to introduce our longtime friend. And personally, he has been a friend and mentor for me for my news and journalism fields. He's always a go-to person. Mr. Wei Shao, he's a partner from Denton's Canada LLP. And Mr. Shaw has provided legal and commercial advice to government agencies and diplomatic missions from both Canada and China. So tonight, his topic will touch base briefly on the legal aspect of the 3M cases, and he'll also focus on the broader bilateral ties in trade and economic dealings. Please go ahead, Mr. Shaw.
Thank you, Lisa. Like Hugh, I would recognize this great day for the First Nations and for all Canadians as a whole. As well, I must say thanks to the organizer for having this event and having us. I would also say thank you to Professor Jiang. I know he's hidden somewhere. He's supposed to be part of the panel as well, but we have his fingerprints on most of every events involving the topics that we are talking about. I had the benefit of reading, not only just hearing Hugh talking about his views, but also the opportunity to read his op-ed piece in China Daily today. So I think I agree with most of his comments. But I will start with some very brief comments on this Meng Wanzhou case. I wish I could speak about some dramatic points, sensitive issues in the case, but let me start with the Chinese side of my experience and brain. For whatever reason, when we see the headline of Meng's release, what came to my own mind was a Chinese novel, a classic novel. It's called, of course, the Chronicles of the Three Kingdoms, Sanguo. That's a novel that every Chinese youth would read, one of the 3 or 4 top novels. It's supposed to be one where you learn all the tricks in politics and in life and business. Words do not necessarily mean what they appear to be, and actions do not necessarily imply the intentions of players. But I'm also thinking of the art of war. And at the very top of these 36 stratagems or strategic moves is 走为上, which means, of course, you escape or run away from the enemy territory as soon as you can. That's the most superior move, or the best choice if you face enemy blockade. So that's what when I saw the news release about this Meng case, that came to my mind. But the whole thing, it's the diplomatic, legal, and political forces at full play. So what started as, I use Hugh's term, a political game of chess, what started as a chess is actually a game, a chess game played in a larger chess game. What started as a chess game ended up as the game of Go or Weiqi, because in Weiqi there's probably no absolute winner. The winner is the one who gains more territory in the fight, in the battleground. And there's many, many more scenarios and choices. Nonetheless, the whatever game it is, the fact that it has come to a draw. So most people are talking about winners and losers in this case. Nobody is a real winner except perhaps the two Michaels, maybe Miss Meng as well, in the sense that it can return to the normal life. But for the rest of the players, issues are still there. At best, those issues, those problems are shelved, but not resolved. So the whole thing looks like to be a geopolitical and geoeconomic drama played in a particular case. I would say that what led to this solution is what happened from day one. There's a political force, there's political will. I remember when people asked me when my personal view, when this Meng case might come to an end. My take was Q4 2021 or Q1 2022, and I cited why. I know that the moves, the strategic and technical moves are happening that would lead to the eventual solution to the issue, which would be a political solution, not legal. Even though in the courts of BC, we see the strong play of Meng's team. I must commend the legal skills, the strategy demonstrated by the Meng team. Madame Meng probably gathered the best Canadian legal minds on the extradition, probably criminal defense grounds. The team has done a great job, and in my view, has weakened the case of the US government. Remember, it's not Canadian prosecution, but the US government case, the DOJ case, that was put into BC court. Looking back, we read Madame Justice House judgment or order regarding dual criminality. This is months ago. If you read the first part, or even the third part, up to the third part of the decision, you would think that the judge would say this is not a case of dual criminality. And one would get the impression that one would be let go because there's no double criminality. But in the end, the conclusion was different. With the passage of time, and if the evidence that was presented to the court at a later time was presented at the early days, who knows what decision the judge would make. I think that might have made the Department of Justice of the US a bit nervous. I'm not saying this is a reason, but there's something in there that you should look into. So coming to what's going to happen next, I think Q has said well about the key points that will shape the future relationship between Canada and China. What I would like to say, and from my point of view, is that more than like Canadian-US, Canadian-China relationship, in the shadow of US-China competition and issues, will likely be one that's cold political relationship, but warm economic relationship, like the early days of the Harper administration just around 50 years ago. I say this because the economic complementarities of the two economies, Canada and China, are such that there are constants that would ensure that the economy will not and cannot be decoupled. But there are also issues, the changes, the variables that would make the relationship from the time to time and sort of a slippery ground. And Hugh pointed to the fact that despite COVID, despite the tension between Canada and China, the bilateral trade between Canada and China actually grew last year and in the first 6 months of this year, especially by comparison with other bilateral trades. On the constant side, that can ensure that there will be a solid business relationship. I would say that we can always refer to the economic complementarity studies that the two governments, Canada and China, put together back in 2012. Those fundamentals are still there. Nothing much has changed from that particular study. On top of that, I would also point to a few more factors, a few more constants that can ensure that Canadian-Chinese economic relationship would continue to be on a strong footing. The trajectory of China's growth, the increase of China's middle class, and ever increasing purchasing power, Chinese demand for Canadian products, particularly the certain strategic materials, minerals, and other products. Canada's the composition of Canadian export, and importantly, here in Canada, the pool, the depth, and the ability to invest and to innovate of the Chinese Canadian business community. I see this as a constant because I'm dealing with that on a regular basis. What is also a constant is the US influence on Canadian-China relationship, both political, to a lesser extent, economic. There's also the factor of e-commerce, which I would say is constant. But there's also variables. Those variables may impact the bilateral relationships on the economic side. The first is the political relationship, the ability of the two governments to anticipate, to control and manage any crisis or accidents like the Meng case. The other thing is, of course, the public opinion, how that can impact on the mindset of decision makers, especially when you have now some 80% of the Canadian population that do not necessarily like China for the time being. The US factor is always a variable, despite the change of different administration may have their different marks, but it's a variable there. The US long arm jurisdiction, US export control, US sanctions, that's another factor. Importantly, after COVID, the adjustment or rebalancing of the whole supply chain, that's another variable that may impact on the relationship. Lastly, I would say, this is quite important to me. If you look at 10, 20, 30 years ago, we have in Canada, similarly, they have in China, people who know the two countries, the cultures. I would say my friends on this panel, both Hugh and John, they have years of experience. But China had the knowledge about China that's missing in this country for the time being. That we have to redevelop. So I stop my comments here. I would like to hear from my friend John. By the way, I traded place with John. John left Canada for China some 36 years ago, and I left China for North America some 37 years ago.
And luckily now, Mr. Shaw, you and John, you actually meet together in Vancouver. So that's great. Thank you again, Mr. Shaw, for your very, very thorough analysis. And thank you for sharing these timelines with everybody. I know if you're not a media person, you probably haven't been diligently follow Meng and the other two Michael's case almost like 3 years ago. But thank you, Mr. Shaw, for giving us such a in-depth analysis, and also to add to Mr. Stevens just mentioned at a little bit earlier, it's a very great numbers that we've been seeing, even though despite the COVID, despite the political battles, Canada currently is under the shadow of US, the bilateral trade between China and Canada. Just for this year, only the first 6 months, we have seen a very strong 34% increase. So that's the message, I believe, is what Mr. Stevens and Mr. Shaw has been trying to share with all the audience here today is now we have the new minority liberal government. That's a public message we want to send out to the new government. As Prime Minister Trudeau mentioned, he's going to form the new cabinet very soon in October. So that's the message the public wanted to hear. So we want to see a much stronger growing bilateral relationship and the trades and the people-to-people movement between Canada and China. So next, let's welcome our third panelist, Mr. John Grusner. He's the Chief Operating Officer from Syncgraphy Inc. and co-founder Intercedent Asia Limited. And prior to returning to Canada, he has lived and worked in China for over 37 years, like Mr. Shaw just mentioned. So he will be, his talk will be focused on the assessment from the B2B angle. John, please go ahead. Do we have John online? John, can you hear me? I think we might have a little bit issue with John. I'm not quite sure. So, so may I take the liberty? Maybe Mr. Shaw and Mr. Stevens, can you both unmute your microphone? Maybe I'll throw a follow-up question to both of you. Oh, perfect. Okay, perfect. So we'll give John a couple more minutes to get reconnected. So his line probably just dropped. Personally, I do want to hear a little bit more. I understand just now both of you have talked a lot about giving us the background and the development since these 3 cases. So I think looking forward, the audience would like to hear a bit more the suggestions you two would like to send out to the new liberal minority government. What can they do? We know that Trudeau is still leading a minority. So how much further can he do in terms of to promoting the Canada-China relations? So which one of your gentlemen would like to go ahead first? Mr. Stevens, maybe you go ahead first.
I will take a stab at that. I mean, obviously, the government has many things to think about, putting together a cabinet and bringing forward its legislative platform. We all know that foreign affairs is not a big driver of policy in this country, but it's very, very important. So, let's be realistic. Canada-China relations are not going to be the first thing on the government's mind, but they have to deal with it. And there are all sorts of reasons, from strategic to economic reasons, that it will need to deal with these things. So we're just looking at the foreign policy angles. As I mentioned, I think the government will continue its push to advance its what it calls its progressive and feminist trade policy. Is John going to come on now, or do you want me to?
Maybe we
I'm
just go ahead and
here.
finish.
Can you hear me?
Sorry. Yes, John, we can hear you. Can we please let
Okay,
Hugh
sorry.
finish his comment?
Yeah,
Yeah, then we'll go to
I'll
you.
just finish these comments.
Yes.
I think the government will continue on its broad diplomatic track to pursue issues in its values agenda, and this, frankly, will probably complicate relations with China. But at the same time, it's going to work hard to get a working relationship, and to be pragmatic and to find ways to build back slowly. As I mentioned, it's not going to be a return to the status quo ante, but I would expect that both countries ought to be able to find ways to cooperate. You know, the mantra for the Biden administration of the 3 Cs: to cooperate with China where it can, to compete most of the time, and to confront where necessary. Now, I don't know that the Trudeau government is going to adopt that holus bolus, but the foreign minister, Mr. Garneau, has already been quoted as saying, well, we're going to be very clear-eyed about this, we're going to be very careful, and so forth. That said, there are clearly areas where Canada needs to cooperate with China. China is a major factor on the global stage, whether it's economic, whether it's political. All we have to do is think of working on the pandemic, which the global community shares as a challenge, climate change, and others, where nothing can happen without working with China and getting China on board. There are going to be probably greater competition. We see it in the IT and high-tech areas. But again, I hope that there are areas where both sides can find a way to work together to mutual benefit. And there will be areas of confrontation, I guess, particularly in the strategic, the diplomatic, political sphere. I personally don't see Canada signing on anytime soon to the Quad or anything like that. But you know, Canada has a very, very strong relationship with the United States in defense and political matters, and that's going to be a big factor. So don't expect to see anything resembling a Team Canada visit to China, or people flocking to Beijing, or Chinese leaders coming here. But I think we put in the hands of our very competent embassy and the ambassador, Ambassador Barton, and you know, dialogue will resume slowly. And at the end of the day, the best proof of diplomatic progress is you look back and you see where you've come from, and it hasn't caused all kinds of ruffles and huge waves, but there's been steady progress. So that's what I think is going to happen. And I'm turn it over to John. Glad you're on now, John.
Thank you very much, Ms. Stevens. Wow, love your speech. And Mr. Shaw, we'll go back to you a little bit later during the Q&A session. And by the way, Hugh, I really love the Team Canada quote. I mean, everybody is looking forward to the coming Winter Olympics. So that will be the world stage to see how big Canada will be doing and how China will be reacting. Anyway, so let me just take this opportunity to once again, let's welcome our the third panelist, Mr. John Grusner. He's Chief Operating Officer from Synchrony Inc. and also the co-founder of Intercedent Asia Limited. And prior to returning to Canada, he has lived and worked in China for over 37 years. So tonight he will be talking about mainly focus on the assessment from the B2B angle. So John, please go ahead.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
Sorry, I was just muted on your side, so I couldn't get in. So now I have access. So that was where I went. I think from a pragmatic point of view, which is what I've been doing for 36 years, I'd start off with a quote from Zhang Tuobin when he went to Ottawa in 1990, and he was the then Deputy Minister of MOFTEC back then, or now MOFCOM today. And he said, if we don't do business, we don't have time to be friends. And he was trying to restore the relationship after another difficult period in 1989. And that led to the original Team Canada, obviously, in 1994, which was then an important element of the engagement, but now is dated because of the business practices, the internet, the nature of the Chinese economy, the Chinese market. But obviously that attitude is important in terms of the cooperation from the perspective of both business communities. But I think that's also dated. What I think is more important is to find areas of cooperation and areas of mutual profit. Because ultimately, if there's no way to make money, the business communities in either side of the ocean are not going to address the current obstacles. And the current obstacles are obviously, in post-Michael, is the level of confidence and that both governments are going to support a business community having a healthy relationship, and also the potential implications of political risk going forward to certain types of investment and certain types of business activities that are longer term. But I think obviously in the short term, the immediate challenge is, of course, quarantine on both sides and travel protocols. And ideally, those can be addressed quickly through the fall and post-Olympics. There'll be a more healthy border environment to allow people to actually do business, because I think these pragmatic details get lost from a business perspective. But at the higher level, what is important is to recognize that in a situation where there are critical issues for both economies and both people, being food security, climate change, energy consumption shifting rapidly because of new policies, and obviously shifting supply chains. Some of those are understandable economics due to labor shortages. Some of them are driven by policy in the United States, which will impact Canada. And obviously the need for new resource sources and stable resource sources. And I think Canada, if China sits back and puts aside the temporary problems, and Canada puts aside and becomes more sophisticated in its engagement, there is a potential to look at the value of Canada as a clean energy source on hydro for some of the production of critical elements of the Chinese industrial capacity going forward. Because ultimately, I think from Canada's perspective, investment in Canada will drive more trade in the non-commodity sector than in what Canada can do on the ground. Because despite the frameworks that Hugh Stevens went through in terms of trade agreements and trade opportunities, the majority of Canadian companies are still relatively small and need access through partnerships and need access through investment in Canada in some cases to be able to profit better in the Chinese market. So I think we have to step back and say that Canada can be in value-added agriculture, in the resource sector, and in long-term strategic needs for the Chinese economy, including the dated ones of pulp and paper and timber resources, that if both parties cooperate and look at it from a business perspective, there is a healthy potential there. Canada, on our side, I think, has to start measuring its success in completely different ways. We benchmark ourselves statistically as opposed to sitting there and bifurcating non-commodity trade and commodity trade. And we fool ourselves when it comes to our actual success in the China market, because we do have obviously a healthy position in terms of soya and canola and wheat, lumber, certain types of metals, coke, copper, potash, sulfur. But when you strip out the industrial goods, there's not that many players that are making a successful attempt. And I think obviously pre-Michael, there was a understanding and there was growing success in the Canadian sporting goods sector, both in ski sector and also obviously companies like Lululemon and Canada Goose. Because I think there is a growing understanding that the China that people perceive and the China that is of the past of people on bicycles and Mao suits is no longer the China today, and it's a high-end consumer market, a luxury goods market with a middle class that the Swiss banking group USB has recognized is bigger than the American middle class in terms of statistical numbers and buying power. So I think we as a business community have to become more sophisticated. I wrote a piece recently about retooling, and that includes board cognizance, better market research, better organizations on the ground in terms of both the government and industry associations to support Canadian companies, but ultimately Canadian companies post-COVID have to put the teams, whether they're partnerships, vested companies, marketing channels, partners, et cetera, a more in-depth and greater commitment to having what I call boots on the ground to be successful in China. And I think we have to look on the Chinese side of what's going to happen. I think in the current election, if you're looking at what's going on, there's going to be a massive shift in terms of the way we treat foreign investment in real estate. And ideally, we'll come to the smarter conclusion as opposed to the ones put forth by all political parties and start using the Australian model, which recognizes global citizens do require real estate and that we can approve projects for foreign investment so we don't have an impact on housing shortages and pricing, and go to the Australian model, which makes opportunities in the real estate sector, even though obviously that's under severe pressure at the moment in China. But it will need to find, once it restructures, new markets, and obviously China has a greater capacity of housing than it probably needs short term, especially if the census is correct and population numbers start to fall. So I think we have to step back, and then from a macro level, and I get myself in trouble with the trade specialists all the time, to me the most critical element is convertibility of renminbi. When you still have a fairly rigid system, both on the capital account, on the trade account, to do what you want as a Chinese entrepreneur or a Chinese state enterprise or a Chinese person, that makes the market anomalies very difficult to become free market driven, which leads to the upcoming question, obviously, of the review of China's participation in the WTO, because I think we can get lost and step back and underplay the value of the WTO as a uniforming agreement, because it had two functions, and one was obviously to provide access to markets on a consistent basis, but the other one was to make it easier for developing countries in South America and Africa to have a more even playing field, even for themselves, in a more sophisticated economy. So if we step back and ruin the WTO, both in spirit in terms of compliance, that creates problems for all of us. Post Michaels, obviously it's been a tense period for both countries. I think Canada and China have to start looking at it in a more granular way. We have to stop talking about China as a specific entity and recognize that we have issues with the Trump administration when it was in power. We will have issues, and we do already. We have issues over pipelines with the Biden administration. So we're naturally going to have policy differences with the Xi administration. We have obviously difference of a system between a multi-party state and a single-party state. We have a different interpretation of the rule of law. We have to start thinking of the market in terms of the state for government procurement, for SOEs, for the public, for private sector, for public companies, and just have a more sophisticated understanding on our side. And, I think Xiao Wei pointed out the deficit, and the real deficit is in having people that are committed and have access to China. And therefore, from a government point of view, I think and there was an interesting article in the Globe this week, which echoed what the China Policy Center recommended recently to the Parliamentary Committee on Canada-China Relations. We need to rotate people from private sector and academia and government and civil society into different positions so that they have a more healthy understanding of what's going on, and they have a different set of skill sets that they're deploying, because I think we are in a period where we're going to have to be creative, because ultimately if we stop doing business, then the risk of not being friends is greater. And I'll close up with the topic of the day. I think it's premature to say that the deferred prosecution agreement is the end of this story. I think there are 3 or 4 questions left: whether there'll be a fine against Huawei, whether Meng, who in China is obviously considered the Leifeng of globalization, and the Michaels are more of a different model in Canada from our perception, of a modern version of Bethune in terms of as a beacon of the rule of law, and there's difference of opinion there. But I think the question I have sitting there is whether the Common Prosperity campaign for China's elite will ultimately have an impact on how Meng is treated, and whether she will be, her position will change. And this rolls through, I think, in terms of, the implications of this situation. I think that if there's anybody accountable for the 5G license, not being granted. It's the recent geopolitics that make it difficult, and I'm not putting blame on that. I'm just raising that what was relatively, in my opinion, a strong failure of commercial governance on behalf of Huawei. It came back and haunted them. And I think that most Chinese companies that I know, Xiaomi, Lenovo, are better in terms of their corporate governance, and so that ideally the powers to be in China look at Huawei as not necessarily a poster person for what they want to represent, but starts leading with better companies that have a greater commitment to CSR and a greater commitment to being public in terms of the stock markets. And this is rather than a point of going backwards, it's a point of reflection, and ideally China's commercial capacity to go offshore becomes better equipped and better, more sophisticated in how it looks at international markets.
Wow. Thank you very much, John. Well, very, very broad areas you have shared with everybody. And I love the suggestion you mentioned. We should be, even despite all the difference between China, Canada, and the US, and under the different administrations, the industry wants a more market towards approach. And looking forward, interestingly, John, you just mentioned about the Huawei 5G license, whether or not the Trudeau government is going to grant it. And we actually do have a question coming from the audience. Just to let everybody know, if you do have a question you would like to address to the panel, please send your question to the account under the name, the Europe Asia Economic Forum. Please send your question to him. Our colleague Wall, he will collect everybody's question and summarize it, because we know some of the questions are overlapping. So he will summarize and pass it to me. So this question is, to what extent will the Five Eyes constrain Canada? In what way? So panelists, who would like to start? Wei, Hugh, can you unmute yourself? And John? So the question is, to what extent will the Five Eyes constrain Canada? In what way?
Well, I'd be happy to talk about it, but I'll defer to Wei since I spoke last.
I'll be very brief. Yes, whether you are talking about 5i or 3i plus 2, there is always a one eye that's much bigger than the other two or the other four. So what the constraint would the 5i put on Canada? I would say it all starts and ends with the US influence and how US policies evolve and change vis-a-vis China. That's the largest determinant. And that's also the largest constraint. You can see that China policy, whether it's from Pompeo now to Blinken, there's a continuation, there's fine-tuning, and that has led to different responses from the Chinese government. The generals are talking, generals from both sides are talking, particularly recently. And I know that there was real nervousness in the fall last year and in the early days of this year. There was real concern that whether it's perceived or real on the Chinese side that one of the islands in South China Sea might be attacked for some reason. That might be the reason why General Millen found his counterpart in China. So tension was that high, but tension was largely from the largest eye of the Five Eyes.
Okay, so Hugh, you want to go ahead, or John, you want to add something?
Yeah, I'd just like to remind people, what is the Five Eyes? The Five Eyes is not an alliance. It's not a military pact. It's an intelligence sharing arrangement that goes back many, many years, basically to the grew out of the Second World War. And it's a sharing arrangement. So Canada benefits, but Canada shares. Wei is perfectly correct that the biggest contributor, the biggest consumer, and the biggest dog on the block is the United States and the Five Eyes. And for Canada's intelligence and security apparatus, the Five Eyes is extremely important. But the government of Canada isn't run exclusively by the security agencies. Obviously, it's a very important part, and security is a very important consideration. But so is industrial development, so is immigration, so is social development. I mean, there are many elements that go into government. And so in forming policy, there's a balance, there's a mix of all these considerations. And I think Huawei is a very good example, because on the one hand, most of the security establishment I think has concerns about Huawei and about its technology, particularly with respect to 5G. And yet we did see for a number of years or for a number of months that the GCHQ in Britain felt that it could deal with Huawei and perhaps allow Huawei access to certain parts of the network. And I understand that there were differences in Canada too. On the other hand, there are industrial benefits, and the fact that Huawei is a big employer, does a lot of R&D in Canada, and so there's the other side. There's the other counterbalance, and do you sacrifice one to the other? That's the big dilemma that government has. So yes, Five Eyes does constrain Canada vis-a-vis China and potentially for some other areas to some extent, but there are counter forces and counterbalances as well, and that's where the government will have to come out, and different governments will come out in different ways, giving greater emphasis or greater weight. So the answer is yes, the Five Eyes is a factor for consideration. Is it the overriding factor? Certainly it has not been up until now. Maybe in this particular case, that will be the thing that tips the balance, but I think we're going to have to wait and see where the government comes out on Huawei. They've already said a long time ago that they would not be allowed access into the core networks. The question is, will it be a blanket ban, or will there be there's a broad spectrum, and where will we land up on that spectrum? I think that's going to be extremely informative to find out.
Thank you, Hugh. John, anything you would like to add?
Security is not my area of expertise, but I would, my hope would be that the Trudeau government sets conditions that can't be immediately met, because I think there has to be a cooling off period. And ideally, on the Chinese side and Huawei side, they're not pushing this issue. I'd like to see, a short-term hiatus. And I've always maintained that one of the conditions to be a 5G carrier should be that you are a publicly traded company, so that you're financially transparent and your ownership is transparent.
All right, thank you, our panelists. So we do have a couple of more questions. This question is, because of NAFTA, should Canadians begin to understand and more accurately assess that bilateral relations with China being triangulated with Washington because of NAFTA? So that's one question. I think we'll just do one by one. And who would like to go ahead?
But I think I'll go first. There's two aspects to this question. Obviously,
okay, sure.
The one that Hugh raised, which is 3210, which is a response to Canada being in the middle of a rather confused journey to a free trade agreement that wasn't completely thought through on either sides. It was politically driven as opposed to statistically driven in terms of the economics and the expectations. But I think the real issue that Canada is not aware of, which is going to come down the pipeline, and again, whether we want to or not, it's a fact to deal with this, is that the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act has a very clear clause that Canada has to file through state a report, or a state has to collect a report, to be more accurate, and file that to the U.S. Congress within 90 days of that act being passed on what Canada's role in that whole scenario going forward in terms of concerns about technological competition is. And that's going to require a fair amount of thinking in Canada at the government level, but it's also going to raise the question, and Canada has always been arguing that it needs allies to be an international partner. But when you're an ally, the other people, especially if they're the largest eye and we're one of the two sets of glasses, has expectations of its allies, and we are going to be asked to fill those. And it's a more sophisticated extrapolation of what Trump was asking in terms of his NATO contribution of being 2% of GDP. We're going to be asked by the United States to participate in their engagement with China to move the dial, and we have to decide whether we want to do that or not.
Hugh, I see you would like to add something. I see you were nodding your head.
No, I think I agree with John.
Okay, and Wei, do you have anything you would like to share? Wei, I think you were muted. Can you unmute yourself, please?
I think I largely agree with John as well. I would just like to add that these are a reminder of my early sort of a similar of the relationship as chess playing, more accurately as Go or Weiqi play. So it's, of course, the players at the beginning of the game would set certain territory for themselves and put their stones there to claim the territory. But there are other ways to make the full play. So the battle is not necessarily win in a particular piece of space or territory. So it all depends on the political will and changes the international relations, geopolitics. That may lead to the fine-tuning of the relationship. But the fact is that the United States today is not the United States of 10, 20 years ago. It's changing, not necessarily for the better. We all know that. Economically, it has its own share of issues. Same way China has its share of issues. So I think if you take this kind of a long-term view, incrementally there will be changes. But I would say that for Canada, we are in an unfortunate place. Because whatever happens in the US, how wind blows in the US would impact Canada, for sure. For instance, in the Canadian export control regime, for any Canadian product that contains US technology, US services, or US products, it's more likely that you have to ask for export license. That's more than just inconvenience. There can be a serious issues to people who unknowingly break that export control regime. We've dealt with instances like that. So it's not kind of a hidden current versus the apparent change or constraints that can bother people, including people in the trade business.
Thank you. I believe this second question from the same audience, I believe our panelists have touched, some of them, especially John in his comment, but I will throw this question out just in case any of you would like to add your answer. Are the parameters on Canada-China relations tighten, especially because of structural shifts, including USMCA, so that's the US-Mexico-Canada agreement? So the question is, are the parameters on Canada-China relations tighten, especially because of the structural shifts, including the US-Mexico-Canada agreement?
Well, 3210 certainly puts constraints on Canada reaching an FTA, and like the CPTPP is a plurilateral FTA, so that does cause some issues. But the U.S. can change its position. The U.S. could decide to join the TPP again. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but it could happen. It's not a given that if China entered the CPTPP, that the U.S. would force Canada and Mexico out out of the new NAFTA. But it's a constraint. But there are many things that Canada can do to develop trade with China that do not involve that particular agreement. I mean, earlier there was mention of the complementarity study, for example. There were sectoral possibilities or areas where the two countries could work to develop their complementarity. That could certainly happen quite outside the confines of the USMCA. Now, 3210 is only an example of Canada being caught in the middle of this triangle. I mean, I agree with the point that Canada, because of the nature of its relationship with the United States, its historical, geographic, economic, everything, is not in the same position as some other country in terms of dealing with China. We naturally want to take account of the concerns of our largest market and our closest ally. So that's a given. I don't think that means, however, that our policy toward China is the exact overlay of the United States. First of all, we're different countries. They have different concerns. As a superpower, the US takes a broader view. So there is limited room for maneuver for Canada, but there is room for maneuver. But there have always been constraints of a sort. Back in the very early days, it suited the United States for Canada to be seen as kind of the one testing the waters that made it more acceptable for the US to eventually move towards recognizing China. The US doesn't need Canada anymore to do that. You could even argue, some would argue, it's not even in the US interest for Canada-China relations to get too strong from an economic point of view. We compete with the US in a number of areas. That said, I think that there are forces in the US that also want to deal with China constructively, and the trade between all these countries is fungible to some extent. So there are areas where closer Canada-China relations will also benefit the US. So it's a very complex arrangement. It's not that there are constraints, but we are certainly not so boxed in that there's nowhere we can go.
John, anything you would like to add, given you've been working in China for 37 years and must be lots you would like to share?
No, I mean, I would just add quickly, I think that in practical terms, short term, obviously the approval of SOE investment in Canada is extremely sensitive at the moment. But from the Canadian perspective, the ability to do business in China is probably more restricted on the Chinese side than anything the Canadian government is trying to do. Obviously, we want to export what we can, and there are obviously a few sensitivities, but Canada is keen to do business with anybody. I think to me, the bigger concern sitting on the Chinese side is that on the commodity side, if our commodities, especially in agriculture, are important to the Chinese economy and the Chinese food security, there's a number of things going on in Canada right now. 75% of the canola will be processed into oil domestically in the next 2 years by 4 major investments, by 4 major international companies, 3 international companies, 1 Canadian, in the Western provinces. So my concern, if I was sitting in the Chinese driving seat, would be 2 to 5 years from now, does Canada actually have any food to offer China? And if that's important to China, then there better be a strategy to make sure that doesn't happen if it's not important to China. The reason is that when you start economic blockades, you create a perception that you're just simply not a reliable customer, and producers have to find stable markets.
Great comment. Wei, I heard you have unmuted yourself. You must have something you would like to add.
Just very quickly, a few lines. On the free trade side, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, there are a lot of issues to be tackled, political and others. But I do see the movement of potential initiative, sectorial, energy, agriculture being 2 of them, between Canada and China, and maybe 3 countries, US, Canada, and China. That would call a new structure, a new platform that accommodate the interest of the 2 or 3 parties. But there are people there looking into that, partially out of the complementarities, partially because there's no political or military sensitivity in that. So hopefully, post-COVID, post-Michaels, those things can be revived.
Great. So our next question, I believe we heard this quite a lot lately, especially now when Canada and some other countries have been losing their border controls, trying to encourage the people movement. So the question is, what effect will the 3M's situation have on international travel tourism, especially for foreigners traveling to and from China? So any one of you would like to go ahead first? Maybe Hugh?
Well, I mean, the big dampener on travel right now is COVID. So we have a long way to go, I'm afraid, to get out of that. But let's supposing we could suddenly wave a wand and we're in a post-COVID world. What impact will it have? Well, I think actually most of the tourism has been from China to Canada in terms of economic benefit. Of course, although there is some probably not insignificant Canadian tourism to China. I think that, I mean, there are lots of Canadians that have been living and working in China through this whole episode, but in terms of public perception, I think China has a problem. I think that many Canadians are going to be nervous and be thinking they might have to look over their shoulder. I think it's probably an unfounded fear, but the fear perception becomes reality. So I think if it's a question of attracting Canadian tourists to China, there's going to be really some work to be done, and maybe the passage of time and the unremarkableness of it, the fact that it becomes just another interesting destination will make things happen. Will we see Chinese tourists come back to Canada? I guess that kind of depends to some extent on the Chinese government, and it'll be interesting to see to what extent they allow the current arrangements to continue. Another issue, in fact, one that's somewhat related indirectly, is the whole question of students. We know there are large numbers of Chinese students in this country, and we also know that a number of educational institutions rely heavily upon the fees paid by foreign students, particularly Chinese students. And so that's going to be a question, particularly given a shifting mood toward China in Canada. I think that's going to be a challenge. We've seen it in Australia, where there's been some anti-Asian racist incidents take place. And I think we've been fortunate in Canada that we've avoided most of that. And I certainly hope that will continue, but it's something that we need to keep our eye on.
Okay. Wei or John, Wei, you would like to add something?
Yeah, a few more comments. Again, I spoke with my clients. Actually, there was added business since the early days of Michaels. I did receive a lot of calls from clients about risks involved. This is a pre-COVID risks involved for Canadian business travelers going to China. That concern, of course, is replaced by concern for COVID. But after the COVID, post-COVID, what would happen? I think Hugh has well covered that. There's another layer of concern. This one is from the Chinese business travelers going to the US. We do have clients who have concerns. They may also have company policies not to travel to the US. Or if they do, they can't carry their notebooks, things like that. Indeed, if you look at the China initiative of the US Department of Justice, that came into being in 2017, that's still there. And I think last year, for a particular client reason, I checked the court record of the DC criminal court. If you look at the sealed, unsealed cases, there are a few hundred of them. There's quite a few defendants in that post case with a name, last name that's obviously Chinese. And these people are oftentimes academia, traders, or people working for government institutions. They were charged for breaking U.S. export control regulations for other crimes, quote unquote, covered by this China initiative. So there is a degree of concern among Chinese business executives traveling to the US or even to Canada. So I hope in a better and more normal world, hopefully that fear can be removed.
Thank you, Wei. John, would you like to add a few more words to this question?
欢迎欢迎.
欢迎欢迎.
I think in real terms, the only imposition on travel right now is for all of us is to obviously the product. I mean, it's a time-consuming, expensive protocol, even if you can go to a country. And in some cases, the quarantine process is quite cumbersome. And then there's the risk of change while you're there, because who knows whether the fifth wave is going to come along or not. So so I think nobody really wants to travel unless it's essential. So I think post Olympics, by ideally March, April next year, the world will be, now that we are getting quarantine certificates or vaccine certificates. I don't like to call them passports because they're ideally everybody can normalize and travel, but I don't think from our point of view in Canada, there's any restrictions, and nor do I think, statistically speaking, there's any risk to 99.999% of our friends from Beijing to travel here.
Great. Thank you very much, our panelists. And due to the time limits, we'll just open for one more question. So this is the last question we have combined. Thank you all for helping us to combine the questions, put them all together. So the question is, what is the real meaning regarding judicial independence and security under the influence of the United States? Will this affect the economic and education exchanges between China and Canada, especially between the high-tech companies? Who would like to go ahead first?
Xiao is the lawyer.
Okay. Wei, can you unmute yourself?
I was looking at a message coming from Yuan Pao Wu and lost part of your question. Can you repeat that question?
Oh, sure. Yeah. The question is, what is the real meaning regarding judicial independence and security under the influence of the United States? Will this affect the economic and education exchanges between China and Canada, especially between the high-tech companies?
That's a very large question. There will always be the concern of the U.S. long-arm jurisdiction, whether in Canada or in some other countries as well. But how that will impact on the education and cultural exchanges, I do not see a direct link. I probably would leave this to Hugh, because Hugh has lived in multiple countries. But my concern, if I were a Chinese visitor to the U.S., particularly if I'm from a state-owned enterprise, I would first check my company menu very carefully for traveling to the U.S. I will probably check the guidelines from China's Foreign Affairs about the do's and don'ts, and especially if my organization also has business in certain regions in the world, which may or may not be part of those jurisdictions under U.S., if not United Nations sanctions. So that's certainly a concern at the back of my head before I travel to the U.S. and after Meng to Canada as well.
Just say a word on academic and scientific exchanges. I am not in the academic world per se. I guess I hang around the fringes of it. Professor Zhang Wenran and others are better qualified to speak on this, but I think there is a risk that in terms of tightening up, and again, we've seen public pressure, we've seen the Canadian media piling on this, China, Huawei has funded some research at such and such a Canadian university, so this means a sellout of Canada's IP and so forth. I mean, it's a little bit over the top. But I do think Canadian universities obviously have to be careful. They have to register their IP, and they need guidelines. Frankly, not each individual universities are not particularly good at setting these guidelines. They're looking for some guidance from the federal government in terms of what's onside and what's offside, and they'll be happy to develop what's onside. But I think they have to be extremely careful. We all have to be careful that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak, that we end up tightening up so much that we cut off linkages with an economic and a dynamic powerhouse. There's all kinds of research and academic exchange that can take place, whether it's on I don't know, insects in grain fields, or I'm just trying to cite examples where the examples are where the fields are non-political, where both sides can benefit, where it's completely irrelevant, frankly, whether the partner is a Chinese institution or an institution in some other part of the world. And so we have to be able to maintain those exchanges for Canada's benefit, to cut ourselves off from the innovation and the research and the knowledge that is in China is certainly not to Canada's benefit. That said, I think there is going to be a tightening. There will be more clear guidelines, and that's perhaps a good thing, so that the academics don't find themselves unduly criticized for working with people with perhaps they've been working with colleagues in China for years or for decades, and suddenly this comes under scrutiny. So we need to have some clear rules. We also have to be extremely careful that we don't end up damaging many areas of profitable relationship and just tarring every kind of academic exchange with China with the same black brush.
If I can add, John, I totally agree. I hope that there are more people who share your view on this particular issue. I know that the universities, all kinds of Canadian universities, have asked for clarity in collaborative projects with China or potential transactions with Chinese institutions. And I think Global Affairs recently came down with some guidelines that added to the clarity of what universities can and should do. Having said that, these are guidelines. In specific cases, it's always universities' call. But my take is that universities, and for that matter, Canadian research institutions, would rather err on the caution side rather than being aggressive. So if they do see a yellow light, we would consider that as red light. Unfortunately, it's hard to balance out.
I agree with you.
John, would you like to add something to this particular question?
Well, I think the original question is whether we have an independent judicial process, and I would say yes, we do, and it has not been compromised. We cooperate on certain issues like extradition with all countries, including China. The most famous being cases prior to this were actually related to China. On the policy side, on technology competition, yes, the US has expectations that Canada may or may not agree with. On the university issue, I think that part of the problem that universities face is straight commercial relationship. If a company, whether it's from Canada or Germany or China, isn't working with the university and it's on a full cost basis, then there is an expectation they get the products of that research. The danger is when the Canadian public is subsidizing that research and the company gets an unfair subsidy, and that's one of the major concerns that people have. So it seems to me that the research can be endowed or subsidized or funded on the corporate side with just having the first right of refusal on some sort of market-based premise for the results. And that takes away a lot of the issues, with the exception of areas that are sensitive from national security. And I think, to be fair, then all countries do protect their research that has applications of national security from foreign participation. But the challenge today in a modern global economy is, including seeds, according to the new directives out of China, the seeds are the next microchips for agriculture. Everything has a national security implication if you decide it does. And that's where the complexity is going to come, is we have to, I think, narrow our definition to what's important in real terms as opposed to optical terms.
Thank you, John. So due to the time restrictions, we have to close for the Q&A session now. I do notice there are quite a few friends, the audience, you still have questions. So we encourage you, send an email the questions to us, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible from the panelists. So in closing, we would like to invite our panelists to maybe give us a short statement, maybe 2 minutes each. Shall we start with you, Hugh? Oh, yeah, Hugh, please.
Well, I guess one of the questions was, am I optimistic or pessimistic for the future of Canada-China relations? And I think as a former diplomat, one always has to look at the optimistic side. There are many obstacles. And as I've said, I don't see things going back to the way it was, but we're going to move into a new normal. And that new normal hopefully is a mutually productive working relationship. We have different views, we have different interests, but we can also find areas to work together. So I think that's what I hope we'll be seeing in the future.
Thank you. Wei or John, who would like to start first? Your closing remarks.
If I can say that after all the sum and fury of the 3 M's, I think there might be, hopefully, there'll be some cool-headed decision-making in all the relevant among all the relevant players. We do see some changes from the US, from China, whether that's part of the arrangement to enable Xi and Biden to meet in Rome, as some people say, or it's just some fine-tuning in their policies. We hope that there will be less tension. Certainly for Canada, I think we are waiting for some important decisions. For China, I guess major moves would only happen after the Beijing Olympic Games in February next year.
John?
I think the question is out of our hands. It goes into the very essence of whether the senior leadership in Washington and the senior leadership in Beijing want to cooperate or pretend to cooperate or continue to drift apart. And ideally, from the perspective of all business communities, there's a desire to cooperate. But if that's not the case, then I think that then, from Canada's perspective, we can have influence in certain areas, and we can try and reduce that conflict. But we certainly don't have the control of either decision-making bodies.
Thank you very much from our panelists. Thank you again to Mr. Hugh Stevens, Mr. Wei Shao, and of course, Mr. John Grusner. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I also want to thank Senator Yuan Wu. Thank you for sharing the Zoom link. I know some of you probably joined us in the middle of the remarks. If you would like to revisit, we will post the whole video on Zoom and online. You will be able to listen that one more time. And if you do have more questions, we do encourage you to check our website, the EAEF, the Europe Asia Economic Forum. Please direct your question to us, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. And thank you everyone for joining, and let's keep the dialogue going. My name is Lisa Wu. It's really my pleasure to join with everyone today, and have a lovely evening, and see you next time.